now we move into our general discussion of blue foods, and I know Timothy still had a question for Adrianna. Yep.
It was just a comment on this, your question, Rashid and Adrianna. You know, the way that biotechnology has advanced in recent years, you know, there's increasingly little reason to extract things from the ocean. You get one, but then you can tissue culture this thing. And to your point earlier about the development of tissue culture for lab-grown meat, you know, this technology is advancing so fast, and it's pushing in all of these tangential directions. And so derivative technologies of what's going on in these 200 plus startups that are trying to grow hamburgers is that we're getting much better at things like tissue culture. And so there's tremendous opportunity to do this in the laboratory. In combination with that, you had these new advancements in land-based aquaculture systems. So while you're trying to farm salmon and other complicated species, you're getting very good at being able to grow things in onshore systems that have very precise recirculation. So if you can, for example, clone a species, you can grow it now in a tank instead of having to extract it from the ocean. And therefore, it's fun. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'll just make a comment and then it's sort of a question about what you just said, is that if you get those original cells from international waters, there is a question of whether that is the common heritage of mankind, and that's what they're discussing in the current negotiations for the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. And it's not simply a matter, I mean, yes, it might prevent overfishing, but some company is going to make a lot of money, and the thought is that that resource originally belonged to all the people of the world, and that money that they make should be shared with all the people of the world. And this is why that biodiversity treaty is so contentious right now. Some countries don't want to give up that right to go out and get that first valuable cell and, you know, and profit from it.
There's no way around it. I mean, you know, like the only way around it for now is to work with culture collections and to avoid expeditions for now until they work out the treaty and the arrangements for these things, because pharma doesn't want to deal with these problems. They want everything to be solved from the very beginning, or else they're not going to invest. Because the way things work now in the pharma industry is that before they had their own labs, Novartis, Sanofi, everyone had their own big labs, and they were doing all the biology. After about 20 years ago, they decided it was much too expensive for them to do that. And so what they would let all the universities and research institutes and spin-off companies and whatnot do all the preliminary work. And if they came out through the across the valley of death where die, then they would buy this company and bring the molecule forward into clinical trials. Okay, and this is the way they work right now. So if you want, you know, like your molecule to go to clinical trials, you have to solve all these problems before you even try to contact the pharmaceutical company.
Comments, questions? Rose? Yeah.
Thanks. I just have I think it's a comment / question. I'm not too sure if it's entirely a full question. I was wondering, I wanted to ask Timothy a question. I wanted to ask about the production philosophy, you know, around the fact that, you know, more is more, you know, and how that sits, you know, with the current debates or discussions around sustainability and managing consumption and the potential impacts of that, you know, on future populations. I think it's more of I don't know if it's a bioethic question as such, but I just wanted to hear your view on that, you know, the idea that we could have these vertical columns of shrimp, just that we produce more so that there's even more consumption, potentially mostly in the global north.
So I would contend that it's not more for the sake of more, but it's more for the sake of necessity. And you're doing so in a way that's more sustainable. So right now, there are so many inefficiencies. I know I said that a lot in my presentation, but there are so many inefficiencies in current farming processes, and those can be dialed up. That way you can provide food for more populations. And that's not just in the global north. Indeed, we're starting with salmon, but there are applications for this. They're absolutely everywhere. And you know, with this food science, we've engineered a lot of ways to feed these animals, but we've done so with you know, with a hammer and screws and nails. And now we've got better tools on the table, and so we can do so in a way where you're creating more efficient systems to produce more feed for more people.
Okay. Well, Martin, but Adrianna, did you want to comment on that question?
That line, I was wondering, you know, like when you talk about feeds that you're using, exactly what is in those feeds? Are there, you mentioned omegas and things, but aren't you also using phytoplankton?
Yeah, so feeds are very interesting, and there's huge variability in price of feed and what goes into these animal feeds. You can imagine a salmon that's grown in the north of Norway is different environmental conditions than a salmon that's grown in the south, or a tilapia that's grown in Mozambique. And so these feeds are developed based upon the specific biological needs of the animals. So very roughly speaking, they contain fish parts, marine nutrients, and those come from wild capture fisheries. Sometimes they come from things like krill that's coming from the Antarctic. You know, you can have a debate about the sort of the ethics around shipping up krill from the Antarctic up to the Arctic to feed these salmon. You've got many different plant compounds. Soy is a major component. This has become contentious in the industry as well because the soy is coming from South America on land that was originally rainforest, hugely problematic, and that's being shipped to Norway. You have a whole range of other plant-based compounds, things that are currently digestible by the animals, but then those that are not, and so they're being engineered. Different types of wood, for example, are now being used in aquafeed. Insect farms are very hot right now. The problem with those is that insect proteins can be deficient in some amino acids. They're not super optimal for some of these species. So there's this broad swath of ingredients that are used, and only some of those are coming from other animals. And there are different ways to optimize that based upon environmental conditions, what these animals need, and so on.
Okay, Mark.
I wanted to raise one question to maybe both of you a little bit. We heard a lot about mariculture, well, aquaculture in the sense of fish, in some ways or form, larger, and also bivalves maybe. Seaweeds didn't show up as an option, so I have no idea. I'd like to invite you to say a word about that on the one hand. And on the other hand, just on the latter part, on the actually mariculture, aquaculture, I mean, from the studies that I read, you know, there's a nice report from the European Union about future of marine food from 2 years ago, and they all make the same recommendation that these things can be sustainable if they're embedded in a regulatory regime that enables that to be sustainable. And the reason why I'm saying that, in many coastal countries that I sometimes work with from Latin America, Africa, and alike, I'm not so sure that they have an understanding that there is a need for a regulatory framework before they enter in a business partnership with some of the actors that bring in technology, say from Norway and other countries, into their regime, and you never kind of know whether they're using the same good environmental practices in that country, which doesn't have the legal frame around it just yet. So what is the role of academies, of the academic community to actually ensure that these things operate from the private sector within a properly designed legally an academic framework in that frame? Thank you.
There was a lot in that question. So let me just take on a couple things. Seaweed. So we didn't dive particularly into seaweed. There is a lot of, I won't say hype, there's a lot of attention to seaweed at the moment, right? And especially going to the UN Ocean Conference. I think the most important thing for me is that so far it's not very significant as a food in very many places. It's more a food additive or a food ingredient in a variety of contexts, and then with some apparent potential as feed as well, right? And there have been some interesting studies on the potential to produce methane production. So interesting, but not yet a significant part of the sort of food horizon. In terms of regulation, I mean, for sure, right? I mean, governance is going to be important. And one of the reasons why we have focused on how do we bring out the sort of relevance of this sector to such a broad range of interests is to at least try to lay the foundation for better engagement by governance and not have fisheries management and aquaculture development happening in the shadows, as it were, right? And being somehow decided on purely economic grounds. But there's a lot to be done then to sort of figure out how do you foster the kind of governance that would make this successful. And I think that goes back to a question that Joachim raised in part. How do we collectively, right, multilateral and bilateral funders, government partners, others, academics, actually help mobilize what it takes to do this well? And how do we engage the private sector in a way that actually begins to generate incentives for doing it well? You were talking specifically about aquaculture, I think, but the same is true, of course, of capture fisheries, right? And so as one example, recognizing the role of small-scale actors and pressing on the needs and the possibilities for governance regimes for small-scale actors that actually begins to change the dynamics around that sector and empowers them to be engaged in governance is one example of that sort of broader suite of things. So I'm not at all saying it's suddenly easy. I'm just saying that, yes, I mean, I think the work we're doing is trying to help us move into those discussions in a more productive way with a recognition of importance. But for sure, you have to tackle those challenges.
And to piggyback on that, number one, seaweed's very cool, but it's very complicated to produce. So it's easy to grow this stuff, and the narrative that you hear is, okay, cool, you put this out in the ocean, you can grow it on a piece of rope, you don't have to do anything, fine. But then you've got to desiccate it and you got to ship it someplace. And so if you're growing this stuff in Ireland or in Scotland, it becomes very resource intensive to dry this out in air dryers, put it on a van and ship it someplace else. So eventually I think there'll be new innovations that will enable that, but it's complicated at the moment. And of course, an obvious place to look is to Asia. You know, folks have been eating seaweed forever, you know, and we think, oh, seaweed, this is really cool, it's this hot new thing. Well, actually, it's been around for thousands of years and it's been a staple of diets. Right? On the regulatory point, there's multiple types of regulations, of course. Regulations around feed, regulations around the environment, regulations on health. A lot of governments have done a really good job with these. You have some sort of self-regulating economies like Norway, which have very strict regulations on aquaculture production. And then that needs to, I think, translate out into these other jurisdictions. Take, for example, the use of antibiotics. 99.7% of the fish that are produced in Norway don't use antibiotics. The same is not true in Chile. I think that will catch up at some point as the market demands it and as consumers demand it.
Okay, we have 4 people in queue for questions. So Jeffrey, Fernando, Joachim, and Rashid. Okay, please go ahead.
I just wanted to raise a note of skepticism about the ability of regulators to keep up with technological change at all, and the willingness or interest of regulators in confronting big companies, profitable opportunities, especially the drug companies. I chaired the Lancet Commission on COVID for the last 2 years, and I arrived at the conclusion that it came out of a lab, out of an EcoHealth Alliance project. It's not proven, but I lost interest in One Health because I saw a completely, totally unregulated environment where scientists are doing anything they want, playing with the most dangerous viruses in BSL-2 facilities in a crazy way without having a clue and sharing it with drug companies. So it's a horror show what's going on. And NIH lies and the regulators are uninterested. So I just want to say, we don't know for sure, but this is a pervasive issue. The technology is running so much faster than government regulators. Everybody's playing around. everybody's got an angle, everybody's got a molecule, everybody's got a gimmick, and we're losing control. So that was my conclusion out of this. I scared to death. And by the way, my experience is everybody lied to me for 2 years about this. So that's my other experience.
Wait, can I comment on that quickly before we go on? Yeah.
There is zero transparency and zero honesty. That's my point.
Thank you. I think that's all right. But I would take issue with the fact that One Health is not a valid approach based upon one experience that's very specific to an event that may or may not have happened, you know? And we can, I think, discuss, you know, the merits of the argument of COVID emerging from a laboratory. You know, for all of human history, infectious diseases have been emerging from the animal environment, you know? And so, in my opinion, you know, what is more logical? There is a laboratory that's placed in a region where there are coronaviruses to study these coronaviruses, and a spillover event occurred there, or this was somehow manipulated in a laboratory. Anyhow, we can talk about that later. My point is that, you know, that One Health remains a valid approach, and there are many, many critical dimensions that it covers, including marine systems and oceans and fish. And I agree that regulation is a very important part of that. But at the moment, I'm on the side of the private sector. We're going to push as hard as we can on this side, and I think it's the job and the duty of the public sector as well to push back and have that debate in public.
And once that happened, anything can happen. And so there wasn't Ralph Barrick beforehand, but now there is. So everything is a little bit different, and no one's watching, no one's regulating. It's a wild west, and that's terribly frightening. That's all. But you're right. The concept, I loved One Health. So I hired Peter Daszak, or to hire him, but I asked him to head a task force, then I had to fire him because everything was lies. So just to let you know, just to be careful on that.
I just wanted to make it, oh, wow, red. Just a quick thing, and this is to follow up later, perhaps, Jeff. So recognizing that everybody lies is perhaps a broader point. Beyond the sort of the challenges of staying ahead of technology, I think many of the things we're talking about in the Blue Food Agenda are more classic development decision-making challenges, right? So it'd be really interesting over time to talk about, okay, how do you do that well, right? And what have we learned about how you think? Yeah.
Yes. Going back to what Martin was talking about, the salmon farming has been delocalized in Chile, and there are tons of pesticides and antibiotics that are being thrown into the aquaculture firms that are changing the ecology of the fjords completely. The salmons escape from the cages and they are feeding on the, maybe in the future there will be beautiful regulations, but now we are destroying entire ecosystems. So these things, and why? Because the rules in Norway maybe are very strict, so they go to break the rules in Chile. And this is not saying that in the future they will obey to the same rules, but like he was commenting upon also in other fields, this is seldom the case. So, and by the way, I was in Bergen very recently. I went to the fish market, and they are selling farmed salmon and wild salmon, and they are very different. And the prices are very different. And if you cook them, the outcome is very different. So, okay, thanks, but I prefer the wild thing.
You know, this academy is special in various senses, but one aspect is we like to think very long-term in addition to acute problems. my colleague and predecessor, Werner Aber, a biologist, likes to remind us about evolution. And so we should at least think about the next 10,000 years, if not longer, and not only about the next 10 years. What does what we have heard so far today mean for evolution in the oceans and seas? What does the temperature change? What does the biodiversity loss, the species loss? What does it mean for near coast small mollusks, etc., who seem to exchange genes? What does it mean for evolution? I think focusing on biodiversity loss is not enough. That looks at what we have and the destruction of it, which is terrible. But may I address this question to the biologists, Tim, Lisa, Adrianna? Would you dare to reflect on this very, very long-term aspect, because we are here because of evolution? How will it shape in the future in view of what we have heard so far? If this is merely a question for the coffee break, Lisa, we can do that too.
Okay, in terms of medicines, global change can change the chemistry of organisms before we've even had a chance to explore them and see if they have potential as new drugs, just to keep on in the line of what I've been talking about until now. Okay, because organisms are very sensitive to change, and this sensitivity is you can see it, measure it in the secondary metabolites that they produce or don't produce in some conditions. And so I think in terms of global change, we're going to be seeing changes in the long run in the organisms that we have been working on. It's inevitable. For now, like the changes are not that big. I mean, probably we're not capable of detecting them with the instruments that we have, but if probably, for sure, things are happening that we can't understand at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Genetic diversity in the ocean is the raw material of evolution. It's what it acts on. If we alter that genetic diversity through climate change or any other action, then we'll change the big long-term picture. But through geological time, species have gone extinct and species have evolved, and that's almost sure to continue to happen. I don't believe the ocean will have zero life at this point. We could do something to make that happen, but we haven't yet, so evolution will continue. So Rashid had a question. Is your comment on this evolution question?
Come on, okay. Jeff has been pushing to the question of whether there is a limit to agriculture. And it's been, you said virtually there's no limit. And this has been a concern to me because I gave a talk about sustainability. Somebody came and told me, why worry about wild fish? They can all go. We can we can farm all the fish we need in one high-rise building in Holland. He told me, I said, whoa, that high-rise must be very high. And will it give you all the inputs and will it take out all the waste? So that has led me to coin a term, and I'm trying to publish this paper because I'm talking about agriculture over-optimism. Agriculture has a role to play, but there's a lot of over-optimism. It's going to solve our problem. And I don't think so. You know that 60% of all the production of agriculture today is China. 60%, right? If you add Asia, you are going to 80, 90%. So what will the Africans, and it's not like Africa hasn't been trying. We've been trying. For some reason, it's not working. And technology does a lot of help, but I'm beginning to worry about technology. You know why? The human side is being left behind. The more we zoom with technology, the more we don't know how to deal with each other. And I think our solutions are more in the human aspect more than technology, right? Frankly speaking, you can, because if you do what you're doing, Norway will have all the money, Guinea-Bissau cannot feed this. Where will the world be left with? So this is where I am now with agriculture. It has a role to play, but there are limits to everything in life, I think. Thank you.
Okay, Roberto, and then Rose. Okay. Yep.
About the blue food opportunities. Of course, I participated 5 years ago to a SAPEA report, the Science Advice for Policy by the European Academies, and the report was Food from the Oceans. And it was an analysis of what we have to do to be sustainable. And it clearly emerged an ecological principle that also Nando was recalling this morning. So we can't continue to feed upon large carnivores. It's like we are eating eagles, rather than wolves, or whatever, in corresponding trophic level in the oceans. We have to go to the lower trophic level. So lower trophic levels means algae, okay? Means, the team was mentioning bivalves, okay? Non-feeding agriculture, expansion of low impact or no impact aquaculture. And this is the first element that should be very clear, because if we want to sustain a growing, human population, we need to go down in the food web. Down, not to fish down, but to go down, to reduce. And the largest animals on the planet live in the sea, and they feed on plankton. So when Nando was mentioning the most abundant animals on Earth are zooplankton, so it's tiny crustaceans. It's the equivalent, more or less, of insects that are now proposed also for, other sources of food. Is right, and possibly we should think to the ability of exploiting that resource, not maybe the large krill that has a very long, lifespan or whatever, but maybe the tiny zooplankton. The point is that, again, we come back to the technological bottleneck, because we have grown fishing the fish, capturing the fish with a net. The people of the developing countries might not have the technologies needed to exploit invisible, tiny, small crustaceans that require vessels, fishing gears adapted to those things. So from one side is moving away from a logic of subsidies in which we increase technologies to fish more, the less fish that remains, and when they fish less, we pay the subsidies to continue in this way. And there are, clear arguments all over the world. Still, the topic discussed today at the television is the cost of gasoline is rising and the fishermen cannot survive in this way. So instead to think on the long term, to say, use the fishermen to build, offshore wind farms or to develop sustainable aquaculture, we still continue to give subsidy. The second point comes to the problem of evolution, that in the short term is adaptation. No? So we often look at the ocean and say they must adapt to the ongoing changes, anthropogenic pressures, global climate change. I like to say that the humans have to adapt to a changing ocean and changing climate conditions too. So another problem we didn't mention sufficiently, that maybe is a matter of another discussion, is oceans and the food they provide are changing as a result of the global climate change. The primary productivity is decreasing, the oceans are becoming bluer, and the expectation is a decrease up to 50% of primary production by 2050. already in the last 18 years, we have decreased primary production that should be equivalent also to oxygen production by 15%. And the oceans, of course, they consume the oxygen they produce, but if they produce less oxygen, they will increase the deoxygenated areas that Lisa and others are investigating very well. So in other words, we are keeping saying something that is wrong. They produce one breath or two, you know, but the point is that they're producing less and less. And instead of adapting and changing our way of looking at the future of the sustainable, you know, oceans, we give subsidies and they keep the business as it is. So this is another point if you want to look on the long term, suggested by the president.
Okay, we're well into our coffee break. So Rose, do you have a short comment?
It's a very short comment. I was thinking about the evolution of taste, actually, because of the sensory field research and you know, that space of inquiry, and specifically the comment that was made by Ferdinando over there. Sorry, I can't see your name. Around, you know, the difference in taste between the wild salmon and the farmed salmon. And I think, you know, we take this notion of adaptation and resilience very seriously. We tend to imagine that people just must adapt. You must adapt, and you must eat what is actually available. You must adapt to climate change. But I also think that there is a kind of a tipping point for humans. We need to decide what quality of life we actually want and what quality of life we want for future generations. It's not a question of just adapting to a declining ocean and a declining environment, because that is the reality. We also need to take into account what kinds of decisions we need to make to secure a better life for the generations to come. So that is evolution, getting better, not just adapt.
Okay, well, thank you to our speakers and to everybody for a lively discussion. I guess we now break for coffee.